They weren't supposed to survive, but they did. And for generations they hid in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, unseen, untouched, and most disturbingly, untouched by choice. This is not the story of a town, it's the story of a bloodline, a lineage so isolated, so steeped in secrecy and silence, that even whispers of their name send unease through the hills. They lived away from roads, outside of time, no birth records, no visitors, no outsiders, ever. The rules were unspoken but ironclad. Blood doesn't leave, blood doesn't mix, and blood never betrays blood. They believed their name was sacred, but what they really passed down was something else entirely, something rotting beneath the surface. America has long buried its darkest family stories under patriotism, under nostalgia, under silence. But when we peel back the polite myths and stare into the raw, bone-deep truth, we find people like them. There are photographs that have surfaced, disturbing ones, where the faces look just a little too similar, where eyes wander without focus, where children don't speak, where the line between brother and father becomes blurred. This is the legacy of America's most inbred family, a story so entangled in taboo, trauma, and generational decay that few dare to say their name aloud. But we will. Because history isn't just about victories and flags, it's also about what we choose to forget. Tonight, we remember the bloodline that time tried to erase, and what happens when family becomes its own prison. Long before cameras found them, before social media whispered their name into the ears of the curious, they were already legends, local ghost stories passed from mouth to mouth by the few mountain folks who dared speak of them at all. The children called them the Hollow People, not for where they lived, but for how they looked. In the dense woods of West Virginia, not far from a collapsed coal town no longer listed on modern maps, sat a patch of land known only to a few as God's Back. The name was ironic, because there was nothing godly about what happened there. The family, believed to be descended from settlers who refused to integrate, had isolated themselves in the early 1800s. According to the faded records and half-buried church documents, the bloodline began with a pair of siblings who were never meant to marry, but did. And from that union, an unspeakable cycle was born. Marriage licenses were never filed. The children were homeschooled, if at all. Their last names changed every few decades, not for safety, but to disguise lineage. A few tried to leave, only a few. Most were brought back, dragged, silenced. Locals tell of a preacher who once tried to offer them help, books, clothing, food. He returned shaken, muttering only, "They don't need saving, they don't even want it." Some say the family believed outsiders carried poison. Others say they feared the curse would break if the blood ever mixed. But by the time the 20th century crept into those woods, their features were already wrong. Too many crossed eyes, too many limbs that didn't work. Too many adults who never learned to speak. And yet, they endured. Not because they were strong, but because they were hidden, and because no one dared intervene. Their story didn't survive in history books. It survived in whispers, in warnings, and in the aching silence of a town that chose to look the other way. And when people finally started to pay attention, it was already too late. The man who finally brought them into focus didn't mean to. He wasn't hunting ghosts or bloodlines. He was photographing forgotten America, those places time chewed up and spat out. He thought he was documenting poverty. What he found was something else entirely. When he entered the edge of the property, camera in hand, the woods fell quiet. He described the stillness as unnatural, not the peace of wilderness, but the absence of it. And then, from a crooked porch, someone emerged, barefoot, eyes wide, yet vacant. He didn't speak, just stared. Behind him, others appeared, slowly, like shadows moving behind warped glass. They weren't surprised to see a stranger, just uninterested, as if they'd seen visitors before, and none of them had mattered. The photographer took their pictures, raw, black and white, unposed. The images were haunting. Faces that mirrored one another too perfectly. Skin stretched over bone, jaws slightly misshapen, and that stare, vacant, disconnected, lost somewhere decades ago. He tried to speak with them, but communication was fractured. Some made animal sounds, some laughed without context, others simply sat, rocking, as if movement was all they knew. At first, people online claimed it was fake, Photoshop, staged. But the more researchers dug, the more horrifying the puzzle became. Birth records missing, death certificates unsigned, DNA lines that looped back into themselves. No branches, just circles. A nurse, years before the photographer, had once treated one of the boys at a remote clinic. She remembered the family. She remembered the boy's confusion at running water, his terror of mirrors, and the woman who brought him in, whom he called both Mama and Sissy. No one followed up. No child services, no law enforcement. Because out here, in the unlit corners of the country, people believe in one rule above all: you mind you, a business. And that's how it went on, generation after generation, with no one watching, and nothing stopping them. The family had a name once, but names fade when records rot and bloodlines twist themselves into knots. By the time the world caught up to them, they were known only by a nickname, not one they chose, but one whispered by those who feared them. The Forsaken. They weren't villains. They weren't monsters. They were abandoned. By society, by modernity, and worst of all, by time. What happens to people when the world forgets they exist? When the only laws that apply are the ones etched into the minds of those who've never left the same patch of dirt? Generational inbreeding doesn't just deform the body, it breaks cognition, warps behavior, and dissolves identity. The newer children in the Forsaken line could not read, could not write, could not hold basic conversations. And yet, they smiled. Not with joy, but with something stranger. An instinct. A flicker of light trapped behind 1,000 years of darkened mirrors. Researchers who later analyzed photos noted the presence of genetic bottlenecking, a phenomenon where repeated incest leads to concentrated mutations. In the Forsaken, these mutations became visible: lowered IQ, crossed eyes, malformed jaws, undeveloped speech centers. Some even suspected chromosomal disorders passed down multiple times from both sides of the same blood. They lived like ghosts, no electricity, no plumbing, feeding from the land and from government supplies delivered without question. Occasionally, a van would arrive, a social worker perhaps. They never stayed long. What they saw wasn't criminal. Not exactly. It was just wrong. But you can't arrest wrongness. You can't outlaw a family from being broken. So the doors stayed closed, and the blood kept folding into itself. Every family has a secret. This one was the secret. The saddest part, they didn't ask for it. They were born into it, into a genetic prison with no key and no windows, and they accepted it. Because they didn't know there was anything else to be. By the time the world started paying attention, the damage was irreversible. Not just to their bodies, but to their minds, their understanding of the world, their very concept of self. They weren't just a family. They were a loop, a closed system of blood, belief, and behavior. No strangers, no change, no chance. A few brave voices tried to intervene. Not journalists, not cops. People from nearby towns, driven by pity or curiosity or some unresolved need to help. But most of them didn't return, and those who did came back changed. One man, a volunteer with a rural outreach program, said it best: "They don't live like us, they don't think like us, but it's not their fault, it's ours. We let it happen. What would you do if this was your bloodline? If your last name was carved into this legacy and you learned it too late? Would you run from it? Or would you carry it quietly like a curse no one else can see? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The horrifying truth is, the Forsaken weren't alone. They were just the most visible. There are towns, especially in rural Appalachia, the Ozarks, deep south communities, where similar families live in the periphery. You'll never see them on the news. They don't vote. They don't leave. And sometimes, they don't even speak. Because there's a line in American history no one wants to cross. The line where freedom becomes neglect and tradition becomes tragedy. We tell ourselves we're a nation of progress. But in places like these, you realize some parts of America never moved forward. They just stopped and kept repeating. And when the blood repeats itself, it doesn't evolve. It unravels. There was a girl once, about 12, seen wandering near the tree line of the Forsaken's property. She didn't have shoes. Her dress was stained with something old, something earthy. She didn't look scared, just lost. A local woman, driving past in an old pickup, slowed down. She called out to the girl, asked if she was all right. The girl didn't answer. She just turned her head, not fully, just enough, and smiled. That smile haunted the woman for years. Not because it was threatening, but because it wasn't. It was the smile of someone who had never known the outside world, who didn't know what to be afraid of, because she'd never seen anything beyond the hills. That's the quiet horror of families like the Forsaken. They don't live in fear. They live in normal. But their normal is something you and I would run from. There's no evil villain in this story. No sharp moment where someone said, "Let's destroy a bloodline." There was only silence. Generation after generation of silence, until the silence became a cage. In many ways, the story of the Forsaken is the story of America's failure to look inward. We shine lights on war, on politics, on global terror. But when it comes to what's been festering in our own backyards, we go blind. There are thousands of forgotten families across the country, living in gutted homes, off broken roads, trapped in cycles no one wants to name. Inbreeding is just one of those cycles. Poverty, abuse, mental illness. All of it is wrapped in shame and sealed with isolation. What made the Forsaken different is that someone found them. Someone showed the world their faces, and for a moment, the veil lifted. But even now, that veil is falling again. People are turning away, forgetting, pretending, because it's easier to look away than to admit the truth. This didn't happen in another country. This didn't happen a century ago. This happened here, and it's still happening. In the end, the Forsaken didn't die out with a bang. There was no fire, no police raid, no great tragedy to mark the end of a cursed bloodline. They simply faded. One by one, the older ones passed, without funeral, without fanfare. The younger ones moved deeper into the woods, until even the satellite images showed nothing but trees and shadows. Some believe a few were taken in by distant relatives, names erased and changed again. Others say they still live in a hidden hollow, far from any road, where no one dares go. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe they've earned their peace, however broken, however silent. But their story is a mirror, not of them, but of us. Of a country that prides itself on progress, yet forgets its most vulnerable. Of a society that hides what it fears behind fences, behind forests, behind silence. There are lessons buried in the Forsaken's legacy, painful ones, about what happens when no one intervenes, about the true cost of isolation, about the slow, horrifying consequences of blood turned inward. Some still defend them. They say, They didn't hurt anyone. But what if hurting themselves was enough? What if generational decay isn't just tragic, it's preventable? And we let it happen anyway. Because the truth is, the Forsaken were not monsters. They were the children of monsters. The children of silence. And in the end, the children of us all. Their faces may never be shown on the news. Their names